Hello everyone, my name is Natalia Ollus and I'm the director of the European Institute for Crime Prevention and Control, affiliated with the UN. We're abbreviated HEUNI. We're a research organization focusing on impactful research, in particular on human trafficking and gender-based violence. I personally encountered human trafficking over 20 years ago when I traveled around the Nordic and Baltic countries to meet NGOs working with victims. The concept and the legal definition of trafficking didn't exist at the time because the Palermo Protocol wasn't yet in existence, but the crime very much did. I met with several NGOs and victims who had experienced sexual violence, and I learned about trauma, but also about the victim's resilience. It's a great privilege to be part of this conference where you, the survivors of trafficking, give a voice to your experiences and most of all, explain to us how the crime should and could be prevented in the future. I'll present to you the findings of a study on trafficking in children and young people in Finland, which we carried out last year. The report is authored by my colleague Elina Kervinen and myself. This report arose from the need to understand what kind of cases of trafficking in children and young people have been identified in Finland. We looked at both children and young people because many of the adolescents had been exploited as minors, but had either only received assistance as an adult or had been victimized after reaching adult age. For ethical reasons, we didn't interview children themselves. Instead, we approached experts who were working with child victims. One of the main expectations of our research was that trafficking in general, and trafficking in children in particular, is very much still a hidden crime. We were able to find out that even among the selected experts addressed in the study, less than half said that they were able to appropriately identify exploitation relating to trafficking in children. Several respondents were uncertain of their own competence. There's therefore a major room for improvement of both awareness and identification of child trafficking among professionals in Finland. The second expectation was that it's very difficult for children and young people to talk about exploitation. What we found was that children may face even disbelief and mistrust when they talk about their experiences of trafficking. The skeptical attitude of the authorities toward child victims can lead to the child being silenced and denied assistance, and also to impunity for the perpetrators. Our report therefore aims to shed light on the shadows and to increase knowledge and awareness of trafficking in children in Finland. Now to the main findings. Sexual exploitation was clearly the most identified form of human trafficking among children in Finland. Three major forms of exploitation taking place in Finland were identified. First of all, there was forced prostitution. The offender was most often the victim's boy or girlfriend or some other person known to the victim. The report revealed several cases where girls had been coerced into prostitution. There was one widely publicized case where a middle-aged Finnish man who worked as a lecturer at a university met a 14-year-old girl who was having trouble at home on an internet discussion forum. The man then lured the girl to living with him, making her dependent on him in many ways. Then he sexually abused her repeatedly, also by using violence for several years, and forced her into prostitution. The girl was exploited around the country and had hundreds of clients. The man was eventually sentenced to 11 years in prison. Secondly, we have commercial sexual exploitation. Our report revealed cases of both girls and boys where an adult had bribed a child or given the child a gift in exchange for a sexual act. The offender was most often either a person known to the victim, for instance the boyfriend or girlfriend, or a friend. This form of exploitation is sometimes referred to as transactional sex, where the child receives money, alcohol, cigarettes, a place to stay, or a car ride in exchange for sex. However, because the purchase of sexual services from a minor is a crime in Finland, in our report we prefer to talk about commercial sexual exploitation instead of transactional sex. In these cases, it's often a question of systematic exploitation of a child, and therefore it could be defined as human trafficking. But often these cases are not, since authorities do not sufficiently recognize the elements of the crime of trafficking. The third form of sexual exploitation was exploitation on the internet. Many of the respondents spoke about cases involving grooming and blackmail on the internet, which eventually may lead to a situation of trafficking. One largely publicized case involved the recruitment of young girls and women for modeling, which then turned out to entail the provision of erotic services, including manipulation, blackmailing, coercion, and violence. In terms of sexual exploitation abroad or en route to Finland, most commonly there were three different forms. Again, forced prostitution and exploitation in general in the country of origin. This was a very diverse group of cases, and often the perpetrator was a family member, a relative, or some acquaintance. There were also several cases of bahabaji that had been encountered in Finland among boys and young men, mainly coming from Afghanistan or Iran. The respondents also described that smugglers had forced children to have sex in exchange for transportation or kept children in captivity, demanding sex as payment for the rest of the trip. The second most commonly mentioned form of exploitation was exploitation in criminal activity. The respondents had encountered exploitation of runaways who'd run away from places of residence, and those with a substance abuse problem were particularly vulnerable. Minors had, for instance, been forced to carry out narcotics offenses, to steal from stores or from summer houses. There were also some cases of unaccompanied boys and also some girls, in particular from Eastern Europe, who had been caught stealing. However, compared to Sweden, there were very few cases of children from Northern Africa who had been forced to smuggle drugs or to steal. What was noteworthy was that many cases concerning criminal activity had obvious features of trafficking, but the offences were often investigated under some other title. Our report indicates that the connection of forced criminal activity with human trafficking is not sufficiently identified in Finland. The third most commonly identified form of exploitation was forced marriage. This included three different types of forced marriages. The first group included young women with an immigrant background living in Finland, mostly girls, who were sent to the country of origin to be married to a local, often older man. The second group comprised of couples with a foreign background, often they were asylum seekers, who had been married elsewhere and who came to Finland, and then the exploitation in the marriage took place in Finland. In these cases, the husband was usually older, much older than his underage wife. The third group was men with a foreign origin living in Finland who found an underage spouse from their home country and who were then married abroad or in Finland. To summarize the findings, the most commonly identified forms of trafficking among children in Finland was sexual exploitation, exploitation in criminal activity, and forced marriages. However, there were relatively few child victims who had been identified in Finland in comparison to the other Nordic countries. This is partly due to the fact that more minor asylum seekers have arrived in the other Nordic countries without a guardian. In part, it could also have to do with the fact that Sweden, for example, has clearer guidelines than Finland for identifying, encountering, and also assisting child victims of human trafficking. Thirdly, authorities' attitudes toward child victims of trafficking influence how the child's account is defined, that is, whether it's seen as human trafficking or as something else. This covers both the social and health services as well as the criminal justice actors. We know that courts of law have treated sexual exploitation of children, for instance, as a pandering offense, even though, in the case of minors, human trafficking provisions should take precedence over pandering provisions, and even though consent and the means of human trafficking are not required in cases involving children. And therefore, as a consequence of not identifying the cases as trafficking, children do not necessarily receive the support they would be entitled to. The lack of adequate resources also affects child victims of trafficking. We have several recommendations in the report, but I'm only going to cover three general recommendations here. First of all, there's a clear need for increased awareness of child trafficking, both among authorities and other actors. Secondly, trafficking should be incorporated as a crime that does exist and make sure that it's considered when encountering child victims of exploitation. Finland currently has a new national coordinator on human trafficking who is chairing a new working group which is putting together a national action plan on human trafficking. The specific needs of child victims is included in the plan, and as a member of this group, I'm actively advocating for the rights of child victims of trafficking. And thirdly, there's a need for a very low threshold to intervene in situations that give indications of human trafficking. Professionals who encounter children should always believe and listen to children when they talk about their experiences of exploitation, and all the necessary actions have to be taken. Finally, I ask you all, if you're interested, to download the report from our website. The link is provided on this slide. Thank you very much.